In our last video, we explored how no liability and strict liability rules can give one party to an accident incentives to take efficient precaution. This is efficient when it only makes sense for one party to take precaution. For instance, if your pet crocodile eats your neighbor's chihuahua, strict liability will be the rule applied. This will give just crocodile owners the incentive to take precaution. When only one party has incentives to take precaution, we call this unilateral precaution. However, what if for efficiency both parties must take precaution? In this video we will explore 4 liability rules that give both parties incentives to take precaution. The first rule we will look at is simple negligence. This requires the plaintiff to establish harm, cause, and breach of duty against the defendant. Recall that strict liability requires only harm and cause to be established for the defendant to be liable. The fact that simple negligence also requires breach of duty to be established gives the defendant or injurer the opportunity to escape liability by meeting a legal standard of precaution. Suppose that Anne dives into Bob's pool and is injured. If simple negligence is the rule, Anne will have to show that Bob did not meet a legal standard of precaution, that is, that Bob breached duty. If the legal standard requires that Bob post no diving signs, then Bob will be able to escape liability if he has a sign posted. If he escapes liability by meeting the legal standard, then Anne is liable for her own injuries. It becomes as if no liability was the rule. We will define the legal standard to be X tilde. Let the legal standard be efficient. Given this assumption, simple negligence can be summarized as follows. If the injurer's level of precaution is less than the efficient level, then the injurer has not met the legal standard and is liable. When a party has not met the legal standard, we say they are at fault. However, if the injurer's level of precaution exceeds the legal standard, then the injurer is not liable. Our textbook authors present the following diagram to illustrate the incentives that the injurer or defendant faces. This shows that if the injurer's level of precaution is less than the legal standard, then the injurer will be held liable for accidents. So the expected cost of accidents for the injurer will be equal to the cost of taking precaution plus the expected cost of harm from any accidents. Since the legal standard is equal to the efficient level of precaution, the expected cost of accidents declines as he takes more precaution up to the point where his precaution meets the legal standard. Once the legal standard of precaution is met, the injurer's expected costs of accidents only include the cost of taking precaution. They no longer include the expected costs of harm from an accident because the injurer will no longer be held liable once the legal standard of precaution has been met. So the diagram shows that after X star, the injurer's expected costs of an accident only equal the cost of precaution. You can see that for the injurer, the expected cost of accidents is minimized by meeting the legal standard of precaution, which we have assumed has been set at the efficient level. So a simple negligence rule gives the injurer or defendant incentives to take precaution. Knowing that the injurer has incentives to take precaution, what incentives does the victim have for precaution? Once the injurer has met the legal standard, then simple negligence becomes no liability where the victim is liable. Recall that under a no liability rule, the victim has incentives for efficient precaution. The victim is what we call the residual bearer of harm. The residual bearer is the person that bears the cost of harm and internalizes it after the parties have undertaken the efficient level of precaution. In this case, the victim is the residual bearer of harm because she is the party that is not able to escape liability by meeting a legal standard. So simple negligence creates incentives for bilateral precaution. That is, both the victim and the injurer have incentives to take precaution under a simple negligence rule. We now consider a rule of negligence with a defense of contributory negligence. In this rule, if the injurer is at fault and the victim is faultless, then the injurer is liable. A party is at fault if they did not meet the legal standard of precaution. So if the injurer did not meet the legal standard but the victim did meet the legal standard, then the injurer is liable. If the injurer is faultless, or if the victim is at fault, then the injurer is not liable. So the injurer is not liable if the victim is at fault, regardless of whether the injurer is at fault. As an example, suppose a pool owner fails to post a no diving sign and a swimmer sues after getting hurt diving. However, the swimmer is at fault too because she did not check the depth before diving. Under a simple negligence rule, the pool owner is liable because the injurer did not meet the legal standard. Under simple negligence, whether the swimmer was at fault is not considered. However, under negligence with defense of contributory negligence, The swimmer is liable because she also did not meet the legal standard of precaution. You can see here that the victim is once again the residual bearer of harm. The injurer has incentives to meet the legal standard because if he does, he escapes liability regardless of whether the victim is at fault. Once the injurer meets the legal standard, he will not be held liable regardless of whether the victim met the legal standard of precaution. This gives the victim incentives to take efficient precaution too. So negligence with a defense of contributory negligence creates incentives for bilateral precaution. We now consider a rule of comparative negligence. Under this rule, if the injurer is at fault and the victim is faultless, then the injurer bears 100% liability. If the injurer is faultless or if the victim is at fault, then the victim bears 100% liability. This rule differs from negligence with a defense of contributory negligence in how it treats a situation in which both parties are at fault. If both parties are at fault, then both parties bear the cost of damages in proportion to their negligence. Once again, the victim is the residual bearer of harm because if both parties meet the legal standard of precaution, the victim is liable. An example of comparative negligence is the famous hot coffee case, Liebeck versus McDonald's, where Stella Liebeck, a 79-year-old woman, suffered third-degree burns in her pelvic region when she accidentally spilled hot coffee that she purchased from McDonald's. The court found that McDonald's was 80% responsible and that Liebeck was 20% responsible. They awarded Liebeck $200,000 in compensatory damages. This was reduced by 20% to $160,000 because she was 20% liable. As a side note, in this case substantial punitive damages were also awarded, but here we are focused on the compensatory damages. Comparative negligence creates incentives for bilateral precaution. Finally, we consider the role of strict liability with a defense of contributory negligence. In this rule, if the victim does not meet a legal standard of precaution, then the injurer is not liable. If the victim does meet a legal standard of precaution, then the injurer is liable. When the victim meets a legal standard of precaution, this rule becomes like strict liability because whether the injurer met a legal standard of precaution is never considered, simply harm and cause. Strict liability with a defense of contributory negligence is commonly used in consumer product cases. The rule implies that the manufacturer of a defective product is liable for the harm it causes to non-negligent consumers and not liable for the harm it causes to negligent consumers. One reason to use strict liability with a defense of contributory negligence rather than one of the other negligence rules is because of the difficulty of proving that the manufacturer breached duty. Here the burden of proof rests on the plaintiff, which is the victim. It may be impossible to prove that the defendant breached duty in how the product was manufactured. Since the victim can escape liability by meeting a legal standard of precaution, the injurer is the residual bearer of harm. Once again, both parties have incentives for efficient precaution. That is, strict liability with a defense of contributory negligence gives incentives for bilateral precaution.